Today, I wanted to talk about a book that I've been reading, Damned Lies and Statistics, written by Joel Best, because it's made me think about statistics in ways that I've never really thought about before, and I'm willing to bet you haven't either. I won't be doing a deep dive into the whole thing, but I did want to highlight two concepts that, as a viewer, I want you guys to take away from it. One, it's to explore statistics literacy and how we can understand statistics as they pertain to their use in the battleground of social issues. And two, the organizational practices that I don't think anyone really thinks about when we talk about statistics. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's talk social problems. And first we gotta get into the definition of what a social problem is. Now, there's two definitions that I want to cover here. The first one being, it's a problem rooted in society, right? The problem is not an earthquake, the problem is racism. Now, this is the definition that most people seem to understand. The second is that social problems only become social problems if they're brought to the attention of the public. If the public doesn't know about it, it's not a problem. So, how do people convince the public that a social problem exists? With evidence. And great pieces of evidence are statistics. Best gives the example of a social problem in 19th century America, specifically female prostitution in the city of New York. In 1833, reformers pointed out that there was, quote, not less than 10,000 prostitutes in the city, which at the time would have been equal to about 10% of the city's entire female population. A few years later, in 1866, the Methodist bishop in the city gave a higher estimate, this time raising it about 2,000, so he estimated that there were about 12,000 prostitutes in the city. It doesn't end there, though. Other estimates in the time went up as high as 50,000 prostitutes in New York at one time. But on the other hand, various investigations by the police and grand juries produced their own much lower estimates. In fact, in 1872, a report from the New York Police Department tallied only 1,223 prostitutes, which is quite a far fall from the alleged 10 or even 50,000. Here, we see an example of dueling statistics. The reformers, wanting to fuel public outrage and prod the city into taking action, they use large numbers to indicate a large problem. The police, on the other hand, providing their own numbers, showing how low the number of prostitutes are in the city, seemed to show that the police were doing a good job. The prostitution was not that big of a problem. We still use statistics to duel today. In America, the issue of gun control is one of the most controversial problems today, and the debates use the same statistical ammunition as the New Yorkers did in the 1800s. Americans who want more gun control might point to the horrifyingly large amount of deaths attributed to shootings every year, while supporters of the Second Amendment might offer their own numbers, perhaps claiming that the number of people dying from guns is actually much lower. Statistics, then, can become weapons in political struggles over social problems and policy. Advocates of different positions use numbers to make their points. It's a big problem! No, it's not. In fact, the first statistics were meant to do just that, influence debates over social issues. It was around the time of the New York prostitution debate that the word statistics became defined as how we know it today. Because before statistics, there was political arithmetic. Studies that calculated numbers like population, marriages, and life expectancy. The people who conducted these studies were called statists, and over time, their social research led to a new term for this sort of quantitative evidence: statistics. But why do we turn to these numbers as an authority when it comes to social issues? Well, numbers offer a sort of precision and science when we discuss social issues. Instead of prostitution as a vaguely large problem, we can now point to exact numbers. There's not just too many prostitutes in New York, there's 10,000 prostitutes. Nowadays, when you're talking about social issues, statistics are pretty much expected. As Best shows us, and as we've discussed, people use statistics to support particular points of view. There's an old expression that follows: figures may not lie, but liars figure. Going back to our example of gun control, advocates for more gun control might point to figures such as the amount of children killed by firearms, while defenders of the Second Amendment might point to the amount of citizens that were involved in self-defense shootings. Both numbers could be true, but the people debating this issue will probably only show the ones that reinforce their own points of view. Statistics have real legitimacy. Large numbers grab our attention, convincing us that an issue is widespread, worthy of concern and action. If the public is concerned that something is a pressing issue, it's more likely that something will be done about it. However, many statistical claims about social problems don't get the critical attention that they really should deserve. And this isn't even an issue of being manipulated by bad statistics or wrong statistics in general. Best writes, quote, "Often, statistics about social problems originate with sincere, well-meaning people who are innumerates. They may not grasp the full implications of what they're saying. Similarly, the media is not immune to innumeracy. Reporters commonly repeat the figures their sources are giving them without bothering to think critically about them." One reason why people tend to accept statistics uncritically is because where they come from. If a statistic originates from a government agency speaking on crime, poverty, unemployment rates, it's natural to treat these numbers as straightforward facts. Additionally, the job of some government agencies, like the US Bureau of the Census, is to produce these statistics. But this tendency to accept statistics as fact ignores the way that the statistic is produced. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. Let's take the example of suicide statistics. Usually, it's the coroner that rules which deaths are suicides, and sometimes a death is relatively straightforward. Maybe the victim left a suicide note, maybe they were known to have depression, or the cause of death may be an obvious case of suicide. But there's two potential errors here. One, the coroner could mistakenly rule a death as a suicide. It's a common trope in mystery novels and things like that, where a death could be covered up. So a murder could be perhaps framed as a suicide. And the second error is for the coroner to assign another cause of death to something that actually was a suicide. Think about people who want to hide the fact that they're killing themselves. Maybe it's for insurance money so that their family can benefit, so they make it look like an accident, maybe a car crash. Or the grieving family is pretty embarrassed by the fact that someone committed suicide, and so they ask the coroner to assign another cause of death. After all, an accident might be more socially acceptable for the family to tell their friends than the actual truth. Best writes, quote, "Official records of suicides reflect the coroner's judgments about the causes of death in what can be ambiguous circumstances. Individual coroners may assess cases differently. We might imagine one coroner who is relatively willing to label death as suicide, and another who isn't. Presented with the same set of cases, the first coroner might find many more suicides than the second." Let's look at another example in arrest statistics. While the coroner only has to rule a cause of death, police officers have to make much more decisions in a shorter amount of time, especially when responding to stressful dispatches. If an officer were to respond to a domestic dispute, they have a variety of options at their disposal. They can arrest one of them, or choose a more diplomatic option and try to talk the couple down, suggesting the two to separate for the night. Or the officer might even offer to take one of them to a shelter to let him cool off for a bit. If this dispatch was at the end of an officer's shift, even that can influence whether he decides to make an arrest or not. Additionally, if a police department had specific hardline actions and policy based on domestic disputes, the likelihood of an arrest could also be affected. At the end of the day, the coroner and the police officer aren't thinking about how their actions might be reflected in a statistic. They're thinking about how to best address the situation at hand. And yet, their individual choices and actions become reflected in numbers that we discuss when talking about statistics. Does a higher rate of arrest in one area mean that locale has higher rates of crime? From the example of the officer responding to domestic abuse, that might not be the case. But to the people who don't think about statistics critically, these thoughts haven't occurred to most people. We oftentimes think of statistics as facts that just exist, right? Easy to observe and collect. But that couldn't be further from the truth. From the past two examples, we can see that statistics for suicides and arrests are both influenced by the organizational practices and personal choices of the people who perform those actions. These statistics are the products of social activity and the choices that people make. Once we understand that, it brings into context the importance of thinking about statistics critically. Who created the statistic? Why was it created? And how was it created? This isn't to get you to look at every statistic with doubt or question every single number you see, but we want to try and recognize good statistics and bad statistics, because some statistics are honest. They're the product of a person or organization's best efforts to capture numbers about a social phenomena. Other statistics might just be wildly wrong. How do we figure which numbers are good and which numbers are bad? what methods should we apply when evaluating statistics? That might be too long to cover in one video, and so I'm gonna have to recommend you to read the book if you want to find out. Or hey, if you guys don't want to read the book or you guys don't have the time, let me know, and it might be the subject of a future video. If you guys want to read this book yourselves, it's Damned Lies and Statistics by Joel Best. You can choose to purchase the book and support the author, or do what I did and find it free on LibGen. Hopefully this video was able to start you on the journey of thinking about statistics in a new light, as well as give you an introductory look into Joel's Best book. Once again, you can find it free on LibGen, and I highly recommend reading it in its entirety. If you guys learned something new, please subscribe and like the video. It goes a long way in showing me that the content that I produce is worthwhile, educational, and you guys are just interested in it, which is my goal at the end of the day. What was the most interesting thing to you? Leave it in the comments. That's all for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.